Hey there, this is Fritz Westover, your host and viticulturist, and you're listening to the Vineyard Underground podcast, where we dig down into the topics and information you need to grow your vineyard. And today I'm hanging out with Dr. Jaclyn Fiola, Assistant Professor of Soils and Environmental Science for Delaware Valley University in Pennsylvania. And we're going to dig deep underground, or as you'll learn, at least 38 centimeters underground, on the topic of soil nutrient interactions and the role of potassium in vineyards. Potassium is a macronutrient, very important. We're going to dig into whether you need a little, a lot, or where it's coming from. We're just going to talk all about potassium today. So I'm super excited about that. Hey, Jaclyn, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about soils, and especially in a podcast called Vineyard Underground. I think it's perfect.
Yeah, it's like your study was made to be on the Vineyard Underground. I'd like to think that, but it's probably the other way around. I was made to follow studies like yours. So here's what we're going to do, Jaclyn. Viticulture and plant science fields are not the most common careers. So I'd like to start by asking, what drew you into this industry, into vineyards and soils? And how did you get interested in plant, crop, and soil science in general?
Sure, that's kind of a funny story, actually, because I took kind of an indirect route to viticulture. I actually grew up around the viticulture industry and intentionally tried to get away from it. As soon as I went to college, I was like, I do not want to deal with this at all. But then I ended up as a horticulture major in college, in undergrad, and was okay with that. Wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do with my life. Was thinking about plant breeding or something, but turns out I need to be outside. I can't deal with lab work, or at least much lab work. And I ended up adding a second major in soil science, and that's where I really, really enjoyed doing that. It was a lot of field work. I love soils, and I was like, I want to be a soil scientist. And I actually got back into viticulture from there because I learned about this thing called terroir, about how soil affects the taste of wine. And I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. And just started delving into like the scientific research and all of these like old Roman writings and these monks in Europe who were talking about how their wine tasted different depending on where they grew it. And I thought that was the coolest thing, and I started applying to grad schools to try to work on that as my career, and have run with it ever since. So I've been involved for 12, 13 years now with vineyard soils specifically, and it's a really cool place to be.
What happens if we're starting to see potassium deficiency in the lower leaves? That to me means, okay, there's already a deficiency because there's not enough to fulfill the entire plant structure. What can go wrong? What direction do we go once we start hitting deficiency in a plant?
Yeah, once you're seeing symptoms, it's not a good sign. That means you've probably been deficient for a while. But you can see stunting of the growth. You can have delayed hardiness, even delayed ripening. Um, yeah, the vines can be look they can have like water stress symptoms. Even though there might be enough water, they might start showing like drought symptoms almost, even if there's plenty of water in the soil. And then that is going to have a lot of downhill effects on that. So you definitely don't want to have deficiencies.
Right. And what about excessive potassium, whether it's in the soil or whether it's from a farmer who's just been applying potassium unnecessarily, or a combination of both? What can we see when we have too much potassium available to plants?
This is where it gets fun, because often we don't care too much about, what we call luxury consumption of nutrients, at least the bigger nutrients. But potassium specifically, first of all, if you have too much potassium in your soil, you can have issues with magnesium uptake because potassium and magnesium are pretty similar size. They behave a little similarly in soil. And so if you have too much potassium, you could have too little magnesium, even sometimes calcium. Sometimes you can see magnesium deficiencies when you have excess potassium. The other thing we've seen is when you have too much potassium, it can affect the fruit pH. So the fruit are really strong sinks for potassium. So if the vine just has a lot of potassium, a lot of it ends up in the fruit. And part of that's because potassium is really involved in fruit ripening. And so that is one of the places it needs to be for the ripening process. But if you have too much, it actually affects, it has this interaction with hydrogen ions. And again, they behave kind of similarly in the plant with like water regulation. And so sometimes when you have too much potassium, you don't have enough hydrogen ions, which affects the pH of the fruit. And so your pH when you harvest is a little bit too high. And I'm not a winemaker, so hopefully I'm not overstepping here. But from what I've read, it can affect when you have the too high pH in the fruit. It can affect like the mouthfeel and the taste. But more importantly, it can affect the shelf life and the stability of the flavors, the aromas, and even the color of the wine. And so it has, again, sort of these downstream effects of the high pH fruit, the high pH juice, and then the high pH wine can have all these really negative effects.
So we talked about what happens if there's too much potassium, too little potassium. What impacts whether or not a plant can take up potassium? And you can give examples of low or high potassium soils. I think it's interesting to talk about.
The main one is moisture, which is part of the reason we have so many issues with potassium, mostly on the high side here in the Mid-Atlantic, because our soils are constantly moist. And moisture soils are going to have more potassium availability. It's easier for potassium to move around. It's easier for it to diffuse. And so that's just makes plants able to get it better, easier to get the potassium. And it's part of the weathering process. Water moving around in soil is actively weathering the minerals. And so we're actually releasing potassium as water is moving around.
Right.
And then things like temperature are also going to affect it. Warmer temperatures are going to allow diffusion a little bit faster. Um, Various other smaller factors, but the main one really is moisture status. And it's interesting because we have a few vineyards that I've worked with for this project and for other projects where I feel like there should be potassium issues. They should have high potassium, but we don't see them. There's one site in particular in Maryland that I'm thinking of that is on this really beautiful schist soil. It's full of mica. And the soil I've tested is actually very high in potassium, but we don't see it in the vines. And the reason we think that is because it's such a dry site. It's on nice slopes. It just doesn't get that much rainfall in the first place. And since it's so dry, we think the vines just aren't getting that potassium. It's not as available to them.
What did we learn about the plant tissues in general for potassium? Was there a trend? You said, because, when you say I did petiole and then I did whole leaf, I tend to use a lot of whole leaf with my growers. And then when we see an issue and we're trying to dial in on a nutritional problem, we might separate the leaf blade from the petiole and get multiple points of information. So what did you find, and how does it compare to what we already know in the literature out there?
We found that the whole leaf, the petiole plus the leaf blade, was the best correlation with the soil. In this case, with the Malic 1 extracted moist soil. By far the best correlation. In terms of how that compares to the literature, there's actually not a lot about whole leaf sampling. I think I called you up when I was working on this because I knew you were one who did whole leaf sampling, and I was trying to figure out why we were seeing this better correlation.
I'm totally responsible now for this treatment. So I had forgotten that you called me, Jaclyn, but the whole Washington State, Idaho, Pacific Northwest guide had put a protocol together for that. And I really think that it's a great way to capture a wide net of nutrient uptake by plants. So it was interesting, when you showed in your work that Veraison versus bloom, the Veraison sample showed the best representative overall status of potassium. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just longer for more potassium to be uptaken. especially here in the Mid-Atlantic where we have wetness throughout the whole growing season. So between bloom and veraison, there's a lot of potassium being uptaken. And it's moving around. It's mobile in the plant. And so we do see it in the petioles, but we also see it in the leaves. Again, it's involved with that water movement and stomata opening and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, veraison was definitely better, and the whole leaves were better.
Indicator of status. Got it. So,
Yeah.
that's more important, I guess, for someone who's really trying to closely track potassium. If you are a grower and your potassium levels come back high all the time in your plant levels, whether it's petiole or leaf blade, you might say, well, it doesn't matter. I just know I don't need to add any. It's fine. But I guess more if you're struggling with a borderline deficiency or deficiency, then knowing when to sample and what tissue parts to sample becomes really important.